Today we're looking at Atramentis 225th Constitution Annivasary. Hi, I'm Adam, and I'm an ink guy. I get inks, test them, and share the results with you. Atramentis 225th Constitution is a blue ink. Before we get to the writing samples, let's look at the sciencey bits. Up first is chromatography, and I agree with Vita that I've learned a lot by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. I put a line of ink down, I dunk it in water for 15 seconds, and I let the ink completely creep up. We see here that the ink went about halfway up to the pencil line and then it stopped, which means it can move, so it's not permanent. It also gives us an idea that it might be easy to clean out of the pen. The one on the right I let dry for 10 minutes before I dunk it into the water for that 15 seconds. We see that it moves just the same as the one that was not allowed to dry, which means this is absolutely not permanent and shouldn't be a problem to clean out of the pen. Resistance tests are done to see how it can be expected to hold up on paper and how hard it might be to clean out of the pen. I let the smear dry for 3 days before I test it. Now the highlighter was a surprising result because I expected that it was going to feather out and reactivate, which it didn't do. It held strong, which means this on a fine nib could be perfectly good for note-taking and highlighting later. Now water did reactivate it, did move it off, but did not completely remove it from the page, which is, again, good news if you spilled it. Now pen flush starts to clean it off of the page, but it is not horrible. It's not all going away. It definitely lightened it way up. Bleach, on the other hand, as I would expect if I got bleach onto the page, or if I'm not saying use it on all of your expensive pens, but if I had to use it, it will definitely clean out anything that remains of that ink. Now this is a bell curve or a normal distribution. For the 365 inks I've tested, I found an average viscosity of 2.5. Keep in mind that 2.1 to 2.9 is the normal range of viscosity or flow of the ink. Atramentis 225th Constitution has a viscosity of 1.87. We see that that is a fast flowing ink. It's in the orange, it's right in the middle of the orange, so it's definitely a wet ink that flows much more. Now this bell curve is for the average dry time. For the 365 inks tested, I found an average dry time of 17 seconds, and here normal is 13 to 21 seconds. Atramentis 225th Constitution has an average dry time of 15 seconds. We see on the bell curve that is well within the normal range. It's just slightly faster than the average for all these inks that were tested. To find my average dry time, I average the extra fine and the medium nib on my writing samples that I do on Clairefontaine, Tomoe River, and Rhodia paper. Now let's get to the writing sample. I got this ink in sample form, mostly gone. You can see I enjoyed the ink. To keep consistent in writing samples, I use a Jinhao 159 with a 1.1 stub in it from Goulet. I use an X450 with a Goulet medium nib, and I use an X750 with a Goulet extra fine nib. Let's look at the actual writing samples. Starting out with Clairefontaine, we see that this particular ink, it doesn't give us a ton of shading in the writing. It really goes down, and it's a straightforward ink. We get no bleed, no ghosting. On the writing itself, we have no feather, no spread, almost no shading, no sheen. It's a boring ink, but it's not boring in a bad way. It's a nice color blue. There is a little bit of shade, but it's only occasionally here. We do get it in the scrubbies, okay? So starting out looking at that top, that 1.1 stub, almost nothing for shade. Almost nothing at all. Occasionally we get little spots of it. I think I need to zoom you guys in. That looks better. Up at the very top, we see a little bit of occur, not a lot of it occur. Only very occasionally. So shading doesn't happen as a normal part of this ink, but it does occasionally happen. And when it happens, it's nice. It's a nice bit of shade when it does
happen. We get to see that nice little bit of shade happens right on the end of Constitution. We get a nice tiny moment of shade at the D of Atramentis. But we don't get a lot of shading much else. One of the darkest spots on it is the I on Quick for the medium nib. I would like more shade from this ink. Regardless, looking at the fine, it's a very nice looking color all the way through. Flat blue, it's a nice light blue, only 6 seconds to dry, so not too bad. When we get to the medium, we see that we get a little more shading, especially in the, right before lazy, a little bit at the end of dog, and that's fairly it. Not a whole lot of shade occurs, but not a horrible color. 14 seconds to dry. The shade looks much more in the scrubby. When we look at the smear in both smears, you would easily be able to pick this up and read what was written if you accidentally smeared it. Now looking at Tomoe River. Looking at Tomoe River, we get no bleed. We do get ghosting. That's a normal for Tomoe River. When we're looking at the writing itself, no feather, no spread. There is occasionally little bits where it gets a little darker right on the edges of letters. Not very often. You almost have to seek out the one time it happens. We do get moments of shade. When I put it on a little too heavy, I messed up on writing my time because I went back and put some more down. I got some shade, so that means if you went over it more than once, after it dried, you could get some shade. You would be painting it on the page, though. No shading in the Atramentis or the 225th Constitution. Nothing there. Almost no shading occurs in the fine. The entire way through, 13 seconds to dry. Medium, a little bit darkest spot occurs. It stands out on the page that it's that much darker than the rest. Goes back to light and still very flat, straightforward. The 8 on the 28 seconds to dry got darker because I realized I started to write the wrong number and I had to go back as it was drying. We do get a tiny bit of shade in the scrubby, and the smear, you might be able to recover it. You might, if you smeared while you were writing on this paper, recover what was written, which is weird with it being such a longer dry time that you still might be able to read what you wrote. Looking at Rhodia, no bleed, no ghosting. You can use both sides of this paper without a problem. Starting at the top with the 1.1 stub, we get moments of shade again. We get it just a little bit on the T's. We get it a little bit on the 2, but not a whole lot with that 1.1 stub. Looking at the extra fine, we get it on the K. The I is again a much darker spot. The only spot in brown is right here at the very end. We get this moment of a little darker. The X gives us a moment of darker. But other than that, it's a really uniform color the whole way through. So if a uniform color is really your thing, this is a great way to go. We have no sheen from this ink. It's got no other standout properties. It does have that nice uniform color if what you want is a uniform all the way through. I think it winds up looking a little bit too like some ballpoint. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference, that you wouldn't be able to see this is not a standout, this is a fountain pen ink kind of ink. 11 seconds to dry for the extra fine. The medium gave us 16 seconds to dry. The medium did give us a little bit more color, a little more ink on the page. A little darker at the K, a little darker at the X, a little darker at the PS of jumps. Again on the, and that's like it. So we did get some of that color variation into the medium, which is nice. Now, I took my show notes here on with a Cross Baily, which is a much wetter nib. And the thing is, it didn't give me any variation there. None at all. When I look back on that, I have nothing. It's just flat blue. It looks like you might get it in the scrubby. You don't get it when I write. When I write with it, I don't get it. I get a nice blue, a very nice blue, but it's flat. Absolutely readable if I was to smear it. Now, one of the things I like to do every now and then is I like to go ahead and use, it's still Rhodia paper. But I like to go to the yellow paper because I want to see what happens to the color if I put it down on a different kind of paper. And it's nice. It actually, to me, stands out a little bit more because look at what happens. You get a nice, this blue, which on yellow and blue make green. So we get a nice kind of green towards blue. So we get that sort of a turquoise going on. But the thing that's neat here is we actually wind up with more color variation. So if you're writing on those legal pads, you get the yellow rhodia, we get some nicer amounts of color variation, which is weird that it happens for yellow paper, but not for white. It could be because of making it look a little green. We get it with some of the 1.1 stub. We got it on the E. We got it on the 2s, both of them. We got it at the bottom, the down motion on the T's. The quote marks. In the extra fine nib, although it took 11 seconds to dry and it looks like it's much more uniform at first, we see that we get the dark spots on the E. It gets a little bit lighter across the top of the T. Dark at the Q, dark at the K, dark on the bottom of the B. I want a little bit, just a pop, just a little on each word, not asking for a lot. That medium nib gave a much darker color all the way through. So while we look at this color, absolutely darker. This is not just one uniform color. It's a neat thing that's going on. Can I zoom in more? Got to pick it up and make it get motion sickness. We get a little bit more color variation on the yellow paper with this ink. That makes this a really neat thing. It didn't get it in any other thing, but when I'm using it on the yellow paper, on the yellow rhodia, I get more color variation. When I'm looking at this scrubby, the scrubby doesn't show as much color variation as I get with that medium. But it is taking 15 seconds to dry on the medium. Smear, still, I can read that smear. That smear is not going to stop me from being able to recover what I wrote. And then I looked at Fabriano Echo Qua. Looking at the top, 1.1 stub, sorry. Definite echo. No bleed, but definite echo. This is a little bit harder to use both sides of the page. At the top, with that 1.1 stub, very little color variation. There is some right at the end of the Atramentis, the tis. We get a little right at the end of Constitution, the shun. But when I go to the extra fine and I go with across, I only see it occur at the K, which my Ks seem to have color variation quite a bit. I get that shading on my Ks. I don't see it the rest of the way here. A little bit on the H. No color variation. This is not a very shading ink. For me, I like the shading ink. On the medium, it's only a hint darker on this top line, and towards some parts here it gets a little bit darker. So the medium's giving us a little bit more shade, not a ton more shading on the ink, but it does give us a little bit more shading. On the scrubby, we definitely see in a scrubby some color. It doesn't seem to come through in the writing. It looks like I should get it. I don't get it. But I say I should. But it doesn't. It just doesn't happen. So this is a boring ink to me. To me, it's not a bad color. I want shading. Smear, I can recover this from smear for the most part. It looks like if I smeared it, I would lose some of what I wrote, but others I would be able to piece it together. So that's where I'm looking at on this.
Instead of finding inks that look like the Atramentis 225th Constitution, I prefer to find an ink that would complement its color on the page. With the Atramentis 225th Constitution being a blue ink, I've chosen Private Reserve Fiesta Red because of its red color. Before I give my opinion on this ink, I'm asking, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if it's your first time here, I invite you to subscribe. To make sure I have a range of experience with this ink, I do a writing sample, then use it in a different pen for a day. I then ink it up in another pen to take my notes for this video. The pen I used today was the Cross Baily with a medium nib. So what do I think about the Atramentis 225th Constitution. I think it's a boring blue ink, and boring is beautiful. Boring's predictable. It's very nice. It comes out the same with just about every nib. Very well behaved. Super nice. It has almost no shading, but it does have its moments that it comes through. So the big question, would I buy a bottle of this ink? If you are a history buff, I think inks like this are perfect. They scratch that itch to be able to have an ink named and designed after something very interesting. If you just want a blue ink, this might not be the one for you. It is a perfectly good boring blue ink. Boring, again, being predictable. I get the same results regardless of the nib that it's in, and boring can be a very, very good thing. Thank you.